that the state's ever faced, affecting all 67 counties. We all now have, I think, we're up to 48 counties that have been included in the major disaster request from the president. I want to first give a lot of thanks to all of those citizens who did evacuate and minimize the loss of life to the best extent possible. I want to thank the governor for all the preparedness that he did leading up to the storm and his efforts following the storm. I'd also like to thank Attorney General Bondi, Commissioner Putnam, CFO Petronas for the great work that they did throughout the entire storm, whether it was price gouging or trying to help both in the preparations and in the recovery and relief. I'd also say very proud of our House of Representatives and my colleagues across the aisle of going out there and participating, whether it was attending regularly at the emergency management centers, helping with the cleanup, getting out there and doing whatever they could to try to make people's lives better. I'm very happy and proud of their work and their effort. But moving forward, I think what we've always said is that to the extent that the governor is not able to do something through his very broad emergency executive power, we would look at what things that we could do. At this point, we believe that the best way to move forward is to create a select committee chaired by Chairman Nuñez that will go out there and look at things that we're continually doing in the recovery effort that maybe we could give recommendations to the governor to expedite to the extent they're not being done now. And more importantly is look to the future and say, we know now after this catastrophic storm that gas wasn't readily accessible. And so having a committee that looks at why does a state in the richest country in the world, third largest, why don't we have a significant gas reserve in the central part of the state so that that's not an issue moving forward for our citizens? We've seen, obviously, that almost a third of our state was without power for some period of time. What can we do to move forward, whether it be underground utilities and a more expansive tree trimming process that allows our citizens to get back and recover and back to normalcy as quick as possible. These are ideas. We recognize that there'll be a cost to them. And we have recognized also, as you guys have seen over the years, as our chief economist has mentioned, that we spend a significant portion of money on what is considered pork projects. If we just took some of those funds or the 630 plus million that we spent last year in new pork funding, you're going to be able to see us make tremendous indents. If we could do that over a 5 to 10 year long-term vision on hurricane preparedness and hardening, you could get to a point where our state, if there is the event of another Hurricane Irma, which is almost a certainty as we know, it's going to happen, it's just a matter of when, but we'd have those opportunities. We'd have a gas reserve, we'd have hardening throughout our state, and all those other types of ideas that are out there. So with that, I'll let Chairman Nuñez talk about the committee and some of the projects that are at hand.
Thank you, Speaker. Good afternoon. Thank you all for being here. I'm honored to be appointed chair of the Select Committee. I'm looking forward to working with each and every member to not only, as the Speaker said, identify what are some of the needs, what are some of the items that were perhaps lacking, and we want to make sure we move forward as a state. I have been in communication with some of the members. I look forward to speaking to each of the members to understand from their perspective in their areas, what are the unique issues that they faced, what are the unique challenges that they faced as each area of the state looked to the impending storm, what are some of the things that we can do to ensure the safety and well-being of our citizenry, which will be our primary focus. Obviously, we will be meeting very soon at the first committee meeting. We will be addressing lessons learned, listening to our experts throughout the state, and obviously trying to improve upon. I would also like to echo the words of our speaker in congratulating the governor and his team in an excellent job. It was a yeoman's task. I think they did it with great efficiency. But again, what are the lessons learned? What are the issues that we can address moving forward? And certainly the Select Committee is looking forward to providing some significant recommendations in the short term and the long term to make sure that we are keeping our citizenry safe and making sure that we are addressing our rebuilding efforts.
I'll take any questions.
Well, in regard to the 8 deaths in the nursing home, deciding who is on the critical infrastructure list. Is that something that should be addressed?
Yeah, absolutely, and that's on the list. If you see, we've put together a preliminary list of topics for the select committee to look at. I do want to say that I think in any kind of situation, when it comes to the government's role and what they can do, some people will act badly. Some people will act negligently. Some people will act criminally. I think what went on with that ALF, and it's no surprise that already there's litigation being filed, was reprehensible, and regardless of what the current statutes were, those deaths were completely avoidable and unnecessary, and they should be held to full account.
You know, there's already legislation filed as well, at least in the Senate. I don't know if you've had an opportunity to look at Senator Brooks' proposal. You have an opinion?
I haven't looked at it yet, but I will. I have talked to the governor. Obviously, the governor, within short order, did an executive order that required everyone to have 7 days, I believe, supply of gas and a generator, backup generator. So that's in place now already, law. And so I think for 90 days, and it'll give us the opportunity to look at it during the legislative session and see where we go permanently from there.
Are there changes this session that you would like to consider look at? I know the panel sounds like recommendations, but is there legislation or things that could happen in this session, changes in the near term that you would like to consider?
Yeah, I think the plan is to be visionary and recognize from this storm. So if we had our druthers, I think that ultimate success would be we come out with a long-term plan for the state of Florida that does those things that we saw in the storm that have negatively impacted our citizens. Gas reserves, that should be on the table. Let's look how much it costs. Let's look how we dedicated funding source. Why isn't there a dedicated funding source to these hurricane preparedness type issues? Underground utilities where it's feasible, and where it's not feasible and not practical. Then let's look at a tree management or hardening even those infrastructures in those current situations. And the reality is, I would say, without having them in front of me, that there is not one single one of those $630+ million worth of new projects that we funded last year anywhere near as important to the health, wealth, and safety of our citizens.
But do you see an effort toward building a fund of some kind that would be dedicated to some of these big ticket issues?
Look, we have, throughout our entire budget, we have different funding sources that are dedicated for certain purposes. And let's look at those purposes and those funding sources and see if some portion of that funding source or some other funding source is utilized for the sole purpose of putting our state in a situation where the next Hurricane Irma comes through, people's electricity is back on, and less is taken off the grid. The gas reserves are not an issue. The flow of traffic evacuation routes, coming back after an evacuation, all of those things could be part of a 5-10 year vision that says this is what we're going to accomplish over the next 10 years, and here's how we're going to pay for it.
Do you think development along the coast should be an issue, and perhaps even conserving more dunes and coastal resources?
Well, it's obviously the driving cost for whether it's what happened in Houston or what happened to us in Florida is the quantity of people that have populated those areas. I mean, I think if you go back to 1920 or something, Miami-Dade had 50,000 people. Now it has 3 million. Houston had 100,000 people. Now they have 6 million. Tampa Bay had 30,000 people. Now it has 2 million people. That's obviously a driver of the cost of and everything from evacuation to recovery. So yeah, let's look at that without restricting people's property rights, but they can't be also subsidized by other people within the state for their right to have and exercise that property. Those are things that we should look at.
Do you think that Florida should engage in discussions on environmental changes and the impact on either the frequency or severity of storms?
I think that the last study I saw, Tia, from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Association said that they didn't see, the studies that they showed did not suggest that there was anything that would link that to the increase. But I'll be glad to look at anything you have.
I want to get back to the statement in the core project. So I can ask the following question. It would seem there's going to be a tremendous amount of requests from members in the most highly affected areas. Let's take Everglades City, for example, which was ravaged. It seemed to me that the senator and representative from those areas are going to be asking for emergency money for road repair, for example. Those aren't in the DOT 5-year work program. Wouldn't those be considered legitimate requests? How can you call those core projects?
Well, to your point, Steve, that's why we're saying the select committee is going to make recommendations obviously there'd be a long 5 or 10 year plan, but as you look at the stuff that we've given you, it's not only moving forward with a long-term hardening preparedness program for the state of Florida, it's also what are those things that we can immediately expend money on. And even now, to the extent that the committee meets in October and they have some discussions that they can send to the governor, he can use as emergency order, but those would be included in the scope and breadth of the committee and be acceptable.
But how exactly is it going to distinguish between what is what is a legitimate hurricane preparation project and what is for? Because I imagine there's a lot of legality around there, sewer and stormwater and stuff that takes stuff. Wanting to get updated hasn't or has been cut by either veto or got in the budget veto. So where is that distinction going to be made?
I think it's I wish I would have printed out the list for you, but I'm sure we can provide it upstairs of the 638. And I think you can go through that list and pretty readily discern which is could be impacted by a hurricane and not.
Regarding gas reserves, you mentioned the idea of creating a gas reserve. There are some people to have suggested that the problem, in reality, with the gas situation was caused by Florida's price gouging laws, and that somehow that drove behavior, and that perhaps we shouldn't have price gouging laws. How do you feel about that? That we should have protections against price gouging laws?
I read some of those articles that were floating around during the hurricane that everyone seizes any opportunity to come out there with their and sell their philosophy. I mean, obviously there's arguments to that point, but I think that the price gouging laws are a good thing. All we have to do is worry about the supply, and that's what we're trying to address.
You know, the other thing I got that the fuel industry normally keeps about 1 to 2 weeks supply in the state. Right now, obviously we exhausted that really fast. We're trying to get out. It seems kind of unusual for someone like you to actually require an industry to require more supply on hand to require that. Is that what you're saying?
No, I'm saying that we could do it, and that's for the committee to look at and decide. What I'm talking about is the state themselves investing in that infrastructure. How that transfer of gas to the gas stations at whether it's the current fair market price at the time that the transfers needed to take place, all of that's for the committee to decide. What we're saying though, as a state, we have a duty and a burden to look out for the health, welfare, and safety of our people. To the extent that you had all of these. Literally across the state for the most part run out of gas, that can be addressed. And how is it to be addressed? How large, how regional? When we have those, if we are able to create those supplies, how are they sold and to various gas stations? All of that's for the committee to decide. Our point is getting there is obviously an important reality based on what we just experienced.
So generators, why the Senate has been out there? I think Senator Brooke actually the governor is having at least 15 days of having these emergency generators. Why is the House kind of banking it on just having this committee look at it? I want you guys just file a budget bill.
I think that's probably imminent. I'm sure one of my colleagues will file that legislation, and that legislation or that issue will be discussed literally in the next 2 weeks. Certainly, it was the number one thing on our list that we sent out to the membership.
Regarding that issue, obviously what you're talking about is requiring a healthcare provider, putting a mandate on. I know that you have been very adamant that some of the issues in the healthcare have been driven by government mandates. So we're okay with the governor going ahead with this emergency rule, basically telling the nursing homes to go ahead and get this going, and you're okay with the idea of the legislature mandating this?
I think that it's up to the committee. Garrett, you raise good points. But you can solve that, I think, in many different ways, and I think you'll see that in the committee. It may not even require mandates. Maybe it's stiffer penalties for non-compliance. Maybe it's more transparency. There's a lot of ways that we can move towards protecting the health, wealth, and safety of our citizens, and we're going to do it in the most result-driven way, and we'll see what that looks like.
But is the legislature at this point in time okay with the idea?
The legislature
emergency rule power to do this?
The legislature is 100% okay at this point with creating a select committee to go in there and look at protecting the people's health, wealth, and safety. No. I don't know if you guys had a chance to read the well poured over and thought out memo, but that's addressed in that.
Well, Speaker, I think that the memo, but how big is the scope of this thing? I mean, are they going to look at insurance issues as well?
On the list. On the list.
Gas station generators?
On the list.
I just want to go back to what I asked you about the environmental impacts. NOAA says that there is overwhelming, compelling story of a planet that is undergoing global warming. That is on NOAA's website right now, and that human activity is the primary driver. So I'm going to ask again, now that we've clarified what NOAA says, should the Florida legislature look into environmental impacts on hurricane severity or the frequency?
I'll get you the NOAA statement. I don't have my phone readily available,
I think
Jimmy,
it's
to.
specific to the
but-
increase
but
in storms.
increase in
not
storms.
that-
Increase or severity, I'm asking, should that be something the legislature should look
No, I
into?
think that what we should be doing is asking ourselves, what can we do to protect the people of this state in the best way possible? And that's what this committee exists for, is to go out there and to say, here's all the things that we learned, here's all the things that we can do better, and go about doing those things.
Mr. Speaker, do you think on the strategic reserve, do you envision the state actually spending however much it would take to build tank farms and distribution systems for it to be under state control?
That is 100% within the auspices of the committee to look at and see its feasibility.
But do you think that would be a good idea, or should it be like private?
No, I think that that's something that's the state has a duty. The number one function of government is to protect its citizens, and it's whether it's foreign or domestic threats or natural disasters. And so, to the extent that we can facilitate that and still allow that. All it is the concept of storage and still allowing it to go out to the free market gas stations at a fair market price is so. It's no different than what we did in this particular storm through the free market. We had tankers that were off the coast that came in as quickly as possible. When those tankers came in, there was trucks. They were escorted by the highway patrol. How do we take that whole concept within that market structure, expedite it to a point that we don't have people waiting for gas?
Nobody's talking about damage to everybody's national park or state parks necessarily. You don't see the homes destroyed and things like that. Power out. Do you think that conservation, not building mine land for conservation along shorelines and coastal areas, would help protect against future hurricanes?
I mean, well, we'll see. I mean, it's a broad question, but we'll look at it.
I have a security question protecting Floridians. With the Equifax breach, it's costing consumers about $50 to put a security freeze on their credit reports. And state law has it that caps the fee at $10. Do you think it's fair for citizens having to spend $50 to protect their personal information from identity theft in the wake of a breach by one of the credit reporting companies?
We'll look at it.
And $3 ratepayers just subsidize $3 billion in third-party. They get their money.
These are all things for the committee to look at, and hopefully, I think you're going to see that those things will be addressed, and they're on the entire grid and what it looks like and what was done and where we can go from here to make it better is on the task of the select committee and the purposes behind it.
You don't know what's an important storm project and what is, I guess, core. Is the committee going to just kind of go through the budget bills as they're filed? I mean, the House rules now how to say if you want to, appropriations project has to be filed before session. Is that how you envision this? They're going to file those bills, and this committee's just going to kind of sort through and make our recommendations?
Well, this would be an additional broad scope policy that would come as a recommendation from the select committee. Those recommendations would probably ultimately be PCBs that would work through the silo that it would apply to. So if it's an insurance issue, it would go through Commerce. If it's a F&T issue, Ways and Means issue, it would go through Ways and Means.
There's going to be committee recommendations on individual budget bills or appropriations.
No, those would be done separately by the membership.
Now that you made the announcement,
Someone on tenure who abandoned their post as a regional chancellor in St. Petersburg because of the storm. They were seeking fire from that post, put tenure $150,000 plus to remain tenure professor.
I think from tenure is a widely debated issue at the university and collegiate level, and so to the extent that those universities and colleges that have that tenure program that exists for those purposes, and they have situations like that arise with a tenured faculty member, at this point I would defer to our universities. Our issue would be whether or not that's adequate or an appropriate expenditure of taxpayer money. And that's the things that we've looked at in the last 2 years when it comes to higher eds and universities, whether it was their educational boards or foundations, or whether it was their direct expenditures, is looking at those expenditures, going through them line by line, and to the extent that we don't think they're appropriate, we'll take that action. But I think there's still more to come out, and we'll see what that produces, Steve.
I would say, what is your usual outrage lacking?
Okay, this is a press conference to try to figure out what we can do moving forward for as a result of Hurricane Irma. I've been gone too long, I think.
I'm a positive influence on it.
Because you are Preparedness Select Committee and you're bringing up a lot of issues. From a broader standpoint, you anticipate that this will change the tenor of the session, that may be some things that perhaps you were thinking about pursuing in your last session, that maybe those are going to be pushed to the wayside?
Well, yeah, I would say the answer to that is absolutely. So I think a couple things. One is, again, I'm going to hats off to Governor Scott. I think that literally over the last 10 years, there's an argument to be made that we haven't, because of the lack of frequency, we haven't been as aggressive as we could or should be, apart from disaster sales tax holidays, in doing those things that we should have been doing or considering over the last 10 years to be prepared better for storms like Irma. And I think that's the goal moving forward. And hats off to Rick Scott. He did a great job of getting out there very early, was criticized by some for it. But as we saw, a third of our entire state almost was evacuated, and for good purposes. And who knows how many lives were spared in that situation. But when you have this and it comes before the state, this is something that happens all the time, whether it's Zika, 9/11, hurricane. There's always those issues that are thrust upon us as lawmakers that we have to take up and address. And this would be absolutely a top issue for the legislative session, which I would probably say to you 4 or 5 months ago, very few people would have put it on the list, let alone number one. But I think that's going to be an absolute factor. I'll take one more.
This is Florida, obviously. I wonder, at this point, is getting the message out to Visit Florida and the various other...
Yes, great question. That's a great question. And I'll go back. When we looked at the whole Visit Florida, again, this is an agency that didn't exist until 1996. And prior to that, you're all shocked to find out that we had lots of tourists. It wasn't this agency that brought them here. But in 1996, it was created, and the concept was, when you have an oil spill, when you have a 9/11 and people are afraid to travel to big places like Disney World because they think that's the next terrorist attack, when you have a Zika outbreak, when you have a Hurricane Irma, and now tourists are thinking that our beaches are decimated and we're all underwater. That was the point in 96, is to give an entity some sort of funding to go out there in those types of situations and say, look, there isn't a single tar ball on our beaches. Disney World is the safest place to be. Our beaches are fine and our communities are together. Come visit. And I think that to the extent that they haven't put that into their plan for the coming year, I think that is the kind of expenditures that I think as a legislative body we would warrant that they should go out and do it, and they benefit the entire state, and we know that they do have value. Yeah, I'm sure they're working. I'd be shocked if they're not working on something.
Isn't it likely that everyone who files a special project bill will find a way to tie it to the hurricane next year?
I have to be careful because I'm the new, better, nicer man. So that sounds like a question for the Senate.
Does storms impact on state revenue?
Thank you for doing that, Joe.
There's no problem. Sometimes
So is that thing really low on battery?